Thank you everyone for coming again. I just want to start with acknowledging that we, the Committee for Microbiology Undergraduate Education, part of the CSM, are joining you today from the ancestral lands, as well as the unceded and treaty territory of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. As we gather here today from various parts of Turtle Island, I would like us to remember that these lands have seen thousands of years of rich Indigenous history. And the colonization that followed led to cultural cleansing and genocide that is still being uncovered today. So as we begin today, let's pause for a moment of silence to reflect on the remains of 215 Indigenous children that were uncovered on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. As we consider this history and acknowledge the harms that are still being felt today, I invite you to consider your place as an educator and how we can step beyond this land acknowledgement and take the calls to actions and nurture and empower Indigenous peoples and spread the message of love rather than hate in our classrooms.
Over the past year, the committee has been very, very busy. So starting with our foam physically distanced edition last summer, early on in the pandemic, and then continuing with a number of workshops and virtual events over the last 12 months. And I've just been really excited to be part of this online community of real people and real educators that have had the chance to come together and share our experiences and learn from each other. CMUE members, Dr. Maria Davis, of course, the CMUE co-chair, Nicole Sukdio, Heather Dietz, and of course, Tanya Noel, who's one of our presenters today as well. And our alumni members, Yanalise Espo and Josie Libertucci have really generously given their time and enthusiasm to make these events happen and really make it a success. A number of these events were recorded and are available on the CSM YouTube page. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you'd like to sort of catch up with what we've been doing over the last year. We're really excited about what we can do in the future. And so if you're interested in joining CMUE, please do get in touch. And I'll be putting in another plug for this at the end. So don't worry about forgetting. We will be badgering you again later. It's worth mentioning that we've had a lot of interest in this year's foam. We've had sort of our greatest number of participants register. And so the impact that we've been able to have certainly hasn't been lessened by the pandemic. The ability of people to attend remotely has been a really sort of interesting silver lining that we've had. Today we have a really exciting program. Our keynote session is going to run from 3 o'clock Eastern time, 1 p.m. Saskatchewan time, or until 3 p.m. Eastern time, sorry. Following the main presentation, we're going to take a 30-minute break, and then we're going to reconvene at 3:30 Eastern time for foam happy hour, where we'll have a chance for some sort of much needed social interactions with a couple of rounds of microbiology trivia, and of course, BYO cocktails or mocktails.
And so today I'm really delighted to introduce to you our keynote speakers for our 6th annual foam. We're excited to have Dr. Tamara Kelly and Dr. Tanya Noel as our facilitators today. Both Dr. Kelly and Dr. Noel are founding members of organization OCUBE, Open Consortium for undergraduate biology educators. And if you do not know about OCUBE, I suggest you find out, and you can always email us and we'll be happy to give you their contact, as well as award-winning educators. Dr. Kelly is a professor in the Department of Biology at York University, where she teaches courses at all levels in genetics and ecology. She has a background in biology, and also she rocks and therefore has some in geology as well. Dr. Kelly is a multi-teaching excellence award winner for bringing evidence-based teaching strategies into her classroom. Dr. Noel is a science teaching and learning specialist at the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of Windsor. She primarily teaches microbiology courses and also is a multi-teaching award excellence winner. She's also one of the reasons why we can gather here today. She's one of the founding members of what is now called the Committee for Microbiology Undergraduate Education. So I'd like to thank you both so much for accepting our invitation. And now I invite you to both take the floor.
Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you everybody for coming out.
I'm just getting my screen set up to share. All right, so as Maria said, I'm Tamara and I'm from York University.
And I'm Tanya from the University of Windsor, currently coming to you from Michigan, as I'm still not allowed to cross the border.
We'd each like to make a land acknowledgement. York University sits on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. I acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region.
And the University of Windsor, and actually where I currently reside, sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect the longstanding relationships with First Nations people in this place in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits des Detroits of Detroit.
So in this session, we want to increase your awareness of some collaborative approaches, some what we think of as simple collaborative approaches that you can put into your classes and their benefits, and give you some tips in implementing them. There'll be more tips in the slide deck that we'll send after the presentation. What we do want to note is that in this talk, we're not going to give you a talk about team-based projects. That's for another keynote. And instead focusing on smaller, more immediate changes that you can make to your courses to create collaborative communities.
And as Tamara said, we're going to be giving you guys some ideas of some strategies, many of which probably a lot of you are already using in some ways. Really trying to focus on things that hopefully will not be a massive overhaul of your entire course. So not a course that's just dedicated to, say, a term-long team project. So even though we consider these small, we do recognize that some of these are going to be a little bit easier, take less time, energy, so on, than others. And we've just tried to give an indication of that with these little icons, going from things that we think are pretty easy, simple to include, up to things that might take a bit more effort or a little more thinking about how you would structure your course to include them. And as Tamara said, we are happy to share all of our slides, including some bonus tips that we're not going to take time to show today. And we'll make those available. We'll make the link available at the end of the session.
So now we'd like you to head to Mentimeter. You can use the QR code here, or you can enter in, go to the menti.com website and enter in this code right here, or you can head to the link that's been put in the chat. And so what we want you to do there is to gauge where on average your current classes are, especially lower level courses that you might teach that tend to be larger in terms of the individual versus collaborative work. And then in the next, so that's the top line. And then the next line, reflect on where you might want those same classes to be in the future. It might be a different answer, or it might be the same. Let us know too if you're having any issues accessing Mentimeter.
And Tamara, let me know when you want me to.
I'll stop sharing now if you want.
Hopefully you guys can see the Mentimeter screen.
Said it was a sliding scale.
I was just thinking this is very different than I'd expected. And you know, we tested everything else in the presentation.
Except that. But it said scale. Scale is not like this or this.
All right, so I warned Tamara, I'm like, this is, we're gonna have at least one moment where something unexpected or undesirable happens, and it's just like teaching. So here we are. So it looks cool.
Yeah, if you want to annotate, that's a great solution, Madison. Shout out to an OCuber who's saving us.
All right, I think maybe I will give this back to you, Tamara, unless you want to watch this for a little longer.
Okay. This was just to think about some stuff. So.
Oh, that's so cool.
What?
Just I'm seeing the check marks as people are annotating.
That's pretty awesome.
Thank you for indulging us here.
The main thing is that we just wanted you to think about like where your classes are and where they might be. And maybe this will give you some seeds for thought of like where you could take your courses.
And at this point, what we are kind of curious about is we'd like to sort of get an idea of where, like why you want to use collaborative or group work in your classes, or if you aren't teaching, you know, but are thinking about it, why you would want to. And we encourage you to either share in the chat, or if you'd like to come on the mic, maybe put up your hand and we could probably get some feedback from some of you on this one. And there's always this moment while I'm waiting for people to type in the chat where I'm like, nobody's going to respond, but I am sure that there will be some responses. There we go. Thank you, Joe. And Madison, did you want to come on the mic?
Yeah, hi everyone. I think for me, a skill as a scientist is collaboration. And I think the best place to start is probably with our undergraduate students to build that skill set. So for me, I'm thinking about the transferable skill part of things.
Awesome, thank you. And we've got people mentioning active learning and yeah, the importance of team skills. Oh, lots of stuff coming in now. Very cool, guys.
For me, it's communication, and it goes back to being scientists. You need to be able to communicate, to collaborate, and starting early on that, just like you said, Madison, I think is really important.
Yeah, and many of you are pointing out how well students learn from each other. Closer to real life work situations. Yeah, and I know often students seem to explain things better to each other than when I try to explain it. All right, I mean, we kind of knew that you guys would be a crowd that valued this, otherwise you probably wouldn't be spending the time here. This is all great.
And yes, you learn new things from students. Exactly. I like Nicole dismantling power dynamics, and we'll talk about that a little bit, maybe more indirectly. but we're happy to have more discussion about things. And so
so as you guys have already explained, science is collaborative, and students often aren't that aware of it, but I think most of us are. Although the way that we often end up teaching them doesn't necessarily reflect that. But in recent years, we've seen expert communities in the life sciences, including ASM, starting to highlight how important it is to include communication, collaboration, and so on in undergraduate education. So this is something that I think, really highlights why we want to try and do this, and is something that is good for students to be aware of as well.
and if you get any pushback from your departments or anybody else, you can always just, guide them to these guidelines, so to speak, and say, look, this is what experts in our field say. So now, if we're going to use collaborative work, then we need to emphasize its value, both to ourselves and to our students. And a good way to do that is to include this aspect in our learning outcomes, or LOs. And one thing that is important is that community generated through collaborative work, and some of you mentioned community being important, especially in large lower level classes, is particularly important for online teaching and for commuter heavy student populations.
Okay, so we thought, again, it'd be nice to kind of model some things for you guys. And this is a question I've given to my microbiology students. And my guess is that you're a little better prepared than maybe my students often are. And I know virulence is sometimes a topic that can be a little challenging to people who are first encountering this. So right now, just on your own, so not in the chat or anything like that, think about how you would answer this question. And we're going to actually put you in breakout rooms in just a moment. So I've just plunked a link in the chat, which I'm hoping that you guys will access so that you can actually see the question while you're in your breakout groups. So it's a long question and I'm babbling away, so I know it might take you a moment just to actually read through it, let alone try to answer it. But while we get you guys ready for breakout rooms, think about how you'll answer it and think about why.
So Maria, did you launch a poll? Yep. Oh,
Right,
there it is.
there we go. So when you feel like you can answer this, please choose whichever answer you would choose in this situation. And this is anonymous. I won't know what answer you particularly chose. We'll just get the aggregates. And usually around this point, I start telling students, okay, you've got about 15 seconds to get your answer in, which is only vaguely timed by me, but just lets them know I'm going to close the poll shortly. Okay, I think we may not get any more. So Maria, if you'd like to end that.
Okay.
All right, so thank you for answering. Like I said, now think about why you chose your answer. We're going to put you into some breakout rooms. This is going to be a little, Tamara, do you want to go? Yeah, there we go. This is going to be a little different than what we would normally do. The size might be a bit different. And obviously, we've got a lot of people who are experts rather than students, but please try and pretend to be a student for a moment and try and think about the rationale for your answer, and not whether or not your PhD supervisor is in the breakout room with you. You do not have to agree with him or her. We'll just give you a couple of minutes to discuss, a little less time than we'd normally give, but try it out. Try it out as a student. And Maria, can you make the magic happen?
Okay, and then Maria, we just need you to relaunch the
poll.
poll. Yeah.
Do we have to wait for everybody to get back before we
Yes.
can? do
43
Yeah.
seconds.
that? Okay, do we have everybody back?
Yes.
I think so.
Okay, so thank you for participating. We didn't visit the rooms, so I have no idea if you actually talked about this or not, but I found students usually are pretty good about it. And we're actually going to poll you again. And you're, of course, free to choose the same answers before, but if you've been convinced by somebody in your group, you know, hopefully we'll see that. And to be fair, this isn't like a conceptually hard one. It's more a familiarity with the term and the fact, you know, well, we'll talk about that in a sec, but
We're getting
I get into this mode and I just want to talk about this stuff.
We could have asked a question about, is it safe to lick rocks? Geologist perspective, microbiologist perspective.
Depends on the rocks.
Exactly.
All right, a few more seconds and then we will end the poll.
Okay, do we want to end the poll?
Sounds good.
So we had some change in answers.
We did. So I'm going to share the final results here. I will tell you that you guys started off, so the correct answer, at least according to what I end up having to teach, and I think there might be some discussion amongst experts, so that could be a whole other thing, but if students are going to be taking a specialized test like the NCLEX or whatever, they need to know that virulence really refers to the ability of something to cause those severe effects in the host, which I think you all recognized. Some people also included other attributes, but by no means are all really virulent organisms going to have antibacterial resistance or cause longer infections. But that's a very common thing. Usually my students are really convinced it's all of the above. And you know, this is something that when they have this type of discussion, usually I get a lot more people who actually start to move over once they start discussing and thinking about, well, why would something have antibiotic resistance if it's virulent based on what we've talked about previously? So not going to go into great detail about virulence, but you know, this is basically something we wanted to get you guys to go through as an example of what I would do in class. And again, I did this one anonymously. I've done anonymous ones before. You might want to do something where you actually can see people's results if you're keeping track of it for some reason. Depending on what kind of polling system you use, there are different types of things that you can do.
And you can see too that there was a small shift in answers between the individual and the group. And that's what you're hoping for. You're hoping for there to be enough people that get it right so that you can have good discussions in the breakout rooms or when you're in face-to-face classes talking to your neighbor. Now, I'm getting ahead of us right now. Often when we use group work, we often give students a question and then immediately put them into groups to discuss. And one of the problems with this is that what results is that some students engage quite enthusiastically, while others are a bit less participatory. So it's not very much of a collaboration because you don't hear all of those voices. So one of the problems is if we put students straight into groups, then we end up with not a lot of collaboration.
Okay, and what I tried to model is something that some studies have found will work better where you use peer instruction, and very similar to the think, pair, share, which is a technique that you can do in various ways in a class where you give people that time to think about stuff individually, do that poll, and it's basically recommended not to show the poll results right away because that can influence the later discussions. So, some polling systems make that easier or harder, but keep that in mind. And then people can go into the peer discussion. They've already invested, they already have given it some thought. And ideally, they are willing to listen to either confirmation for why they're doing well, or, be able to provide some idea of where there might be challenges, what they weren't sure about, And this is what we would consider to be the two-stage approach. So that second polling after the peer discussion, we usually get to see a bigger shift in the correct answer. And that might lead to a better class-wide discussion at the end as well.
So why, by simply introducing an opportunity for students to answer a question individually, does that increase contributions from all students during the group part? So if you could just pop your answer into the chat, why you think that might happen? Less intimidating? Thinking
Time.
takes time.
Yep. Yeah, Joe, that's something I've seen. You more likely get other people who can speak up.
Easier to get a word in.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Tamara.
No, it's okay, Tanya.
I was just going to say the embarrassment and the fear of things that are good to remember, and sometimes I know I forget. Nobody wants to think that they're wrong. Nobody wants to hear that they're wrong or seem like they're wrong in front of their peers. But this kind of discussion often allows people to have a discussion that sort of is less scary than, say, just doing it in the whole class.
Yeah, so by putting students into groups, I mean, any large group of people, by dividing them up into smaller groups, it makes it less intimidating. And by giving people an opportunity to think ahead of time before they go into the group, you've hit on all of these things. It allows time for people to formulate their ideas, their reasoning, so they enter a group prepared, at least with an answer, and they might then be more comfortable contributing. And it can minimize exactly what some of you have said, that the students who tend to, the impact of students who tend to think out loud and tend to dominate the early parts of a discussion and can actually end up silencing some voices within the group.
Yeah, and Alexander, I think the idea of having a stake also means, again, even if you're shy, you might be more willing to speak up.
Oops. Now, instead of clicker questions, we can use worksheets. Worksheets are great for diving in deeper into a topic or scenario. You can challenge students to use higher order thinking, which some of you have mentioned before, reasoning, evaluation, analyzing, synthesizing. In face-to-face classes, use paper, but you could get students to use Google Docs as well. I've done that before. And you could, I try to keep mine, if I'm printing them out, to the one page front and back at the most. Online, you can Google Docs or Google Forms. And depending on the size of the class and the goals that you've set out, because you want to align your worksheets and any clicker questions or any activity you do in class with your learning outcomes, you could have all of the students using the exact same worksheet. Or what you could do is you could generate different worksheets for different groups. So you might have 3 different case studies or scenarios, and then you just randomly distribute these among the different groups. Or you could give each group a subset of a larger set of questions that you've had.
And if you're wondering what that might look like, I did some of this in the fall. I tend to use worksheets quite a bit. With face-to-face, generally paper, but not an option in the fall for me. So what I ended up doing this time is set things up online for our synchronous classes. And there were some asynchronous things students were expected to do. So there were a couple of short videos on some of the techniques and the issues that I wanted them to think about, and also some questions for them to think about. I also had a little, very low weight quiz that they were supposed to do before they came to class, joined us online. And that actually gave me an idea of some of the things that students were struggling with. And in particular, some of them seem to not quite understand the difference between looking at plate counts when you're looking at samples of environmental bacteria compared to what you see with microscopic cell counts. Next slide, Tamara. So students in the class did all that stuff ahead of time. And in class, we started very briefly talking about, again, viable cell count versus the direct cell count, ability to grow things and then count them versus taking it directly from the environment and looking at the cells that are present. Yeah, this has been something that I've been trying to teach for years. And my microbial ecology students were super keen. Like they wanted to understand this stuff. So this was a fun group to work with. But I really wanted them to understand some of these limitations before we got deep into some of the methods that we were going to be using. Although I briefly touched on the idea that molecular methods can be used to identify things in a sample, as well as the ones we're talking about here. So very briefly, we'd had this discussion. And following that, then I had my students go to pre-assigned teams. I was using Microsoft Teams. We didn't have breakout rooms, but I used channels, which work very similarly to breakout rooms. And I gave them worksheets to work on. And we figured it might be fun for you to kind of see that in action. So we have set up worksheets for you guys. And what I'm going to ask is that you go to the folder that I just put the link in for, and you should see a number of worksheets that have numbers. And in a moment, Maria is going to put you back into breakout rooms, take a look at your room number, and go to the worksheet that corresponds with your room number. And again, this is more just for you to try it out, but see if your group can try and answer some of the questions there. And the worksheet should all be editable. So you can go ahead. We'll give you guys a few minutes for that. And Maria, would you like to be able to?
Tanya, do you want me to put them in the same rooms or different rooms?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, I'll just do the easy thing in same rooms then.
Okay, so I think pretty much everybody's back. So thank you. I always get such a huge kick seeing people working on these in real time, which, for me, I don't know why I find that so much fun. But at this point, I'd actually be curious to see what you guys thought of that experience. So once again, we're going to invite you. Oh, Jesse liked it. Okay, that's cool. What else did you guys think? And again, if you want to, you can put it in the chat, or you can put your hand up and come on the mic. I'd be interested in getting your experiences. Okay, so Nicole also enjoyed. Glad to hear that. Yeah, I started including that question about what questions did you guys have on almost all my worksheets, because it's often really illuminating. Oh yeah, and this I probably should have explained to you more. This is a 4th year course. They've had intro micro, they've had ecology. We've already gone through, a few things to start with. But I also find the students seem to enjoy it more if it's challenging. Yeah, this is something that surprised me a little bit.
And the other thing is too, you're getting them to prepare ahead of time, right? There's still that individual aspect that is incorporated into this. So
Madison, we'll touch on that in a moment. Oh, no, actually, I don't think we will, because I think
no, go ahead now though, you can.
Okay. So yeah, Alex, I could see that the students got used to it pretty quickly, but I think to start with, it's probably a little overwhelming. And in terms of taking up the answers with any worksheet I do, I don't take up the answers usually or talk about them much until they submit them, with the exception of if I have a question that's very clearly gone pear-shaped, like what I put there obviously isn't what they understand the question to be asking, or if they're really getting stuck, I will jump in, and I can because I can see what's happening. And I usually do jump into the different channels or breakout rooms to see if anybody has questions. So I didn't model that for you guys, but I would definitely recommend it if you've got something, especially that might be challenging. I will also say these are not high stakes. I tend to give most of the marks that are attached to these are for making what I would say a good faith attempt is. But you could obviously decide to do this worth a bit more or worth, for participation only. There's lots of options depending on what works for you.
And the other, when you're doing these, as you're going through the term too, students get more and more used to this. It becomes that you have certain cues and things like that. Like I color code my slides mainly for myself, that my clicker questions are on yellow slides, my think with your group is on a blue slide. And so students start, generally see the type of question, and I have a little icon at the top, and they know exactly what to do at that point in time. So it's, it does, somebody had mentioned, it gets them, and Nicole had mentioned, it gets them comfortable talking in a group, thinking about this. And again, they've had preparation ahead of time. And what's great, Tanya, can I move to the next slide?
Yeah, one thing I thought I would mention is Alexander Hines was talking about somebody writing stuff and others nodding along. That is a risk, although I found usually there's more, I see a divide and conquer more than that, which might also be problematic in some cases, but there are some things to keep in mind when you're giving directions to students about this.
And one of the recommendations you could use group worksheets, and you can just take a collection of practice questions if you want. But if you have questions that build on each other based on a scenario, that's even better. But what's nice about worksheets is that a study at UBC actually found that of all the easily implemented in-class group activities, worksheets had the largest impact on student learning, student performance. So it's a really good entry point. And that was regardless of how they were implemented. They saw larger learning gains where the worksheets were really well structured, et cetera. But worksheets on their own, because you're giving students time on task, really help drive student understanding of the material. And we have tips for using worksheets in the file that we'll give you at the end of the talk. And if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please just email us. Our email is going to be in there as well.
Okay, so another tool that probably all of you guys have at your fingertips, so to speak, would be things like your discussion boards in your LMS. And the LMS includes a number of things that can be used collaboratively, including wikis and blogs, but I find discussion boards pretty good as a way to bring in some things, including things that you might want to do with a worksheet, but not synchronously. So some of the questions you might ask there. So for example, my first year or my introductory micro, I'll sometimes post, I'll post guided discussion questions where students get to choose a question and answer it, and other people can respond. And again, a lot of differences in terms of quality of the responses and the interactions, but I've been generally pretty impressed by the effort that people tend to make when they're coming in and responding to somebody else's post or the original post. And I'll also note that depending on your LMS and the discussion board, you can probably adjust some of the settings for your discussion board. So for some things, you might want it so that somebody has to put a post up before they can see the other posts in that topic. In other cases, you might want to let everybody see everything. This would be an example where I let everybody see everything because I don't want them answering the same thing over and over if it's already been answered. They can comment on the same question as long as they're not repeating what's in somebody else's post. And sorry, I was going to say, make these interesting, provocative, or kind of challenging if you really want students to dig into it and interact.
And we were talking about taking up the worksheets. Some people were talking about that in the chat. You can use discussion boards to do that if you'd like. One of the main things is with worksheets is that you don't want to take it up in the class so that students just sit around waiting until you take it up. You want them to have answers. So for my first year class, they actually have to submit their answers and then we take it up, because I found that otherwise they just sit there waiting until, because they have to design an experiment and it's really uncomfortable for them. but it's reassuring them that even just a fair try at this, they will get the points for this. But the discussion board has been really helpful for dealing with questions about worksheets. So I'm sorry to take us back there, Tanya, but that just crossed my mind.
No, that's a good point.
Now, if you've never used collaborative work in your class, and the thought of doing so can feel pretty overwhelming, but there is a really simple place to start with collaboration that doesn't involve changing your class, so to speak. So do you often sit alone during your office hours, or have some students come by, but you answer the same question again and again and again and again in a linear fashion? You might want to consider holding group office hours. Maybe you're already doing so, but it's really good to be intentional about these. When you're in a face-to-face environment, you could hold these in a room that is in or near a common study area. So this is the study area in our life science building at York University. And I just go in there and sit there at a table looking lonely until students from my class come in there. And in the meantime, I get a lot of questions from students that I've had from my previous years. It's best if you can have a blackboard or a whiteboard. So recently we had a renovation in our building, not a great one, but they renovated so that we had meeting rooms on the ground floor. So I actually book those now and hold my office hours there. And there's some nice whiteboards. And online, you could hold these immediately after your synchronous sessions when students are hanging around. And what I mean by intentional is that have students introduce themselves to each other. When a student asks you a question, put it out to the whole group. Ask everybody to do it on their own. Give them a minute or two, and then get them to get into pairs and explain it to each other, and then take it up. Students they get to know each other. Especially in those large classes, this is how students can meet each other, and you can facilitate that. And then you ask students to provide the answers. Again, you're not answering their question directly. They are answering each other's questions. And it gives us a lot of insight, just like what you were talking about with the worksheets, of where students struggle. Sometimes at the beginning of the term, students are a little bit shy to ask questions. Come with some common questions that you know from previous years or that you had as a student, and ask those, put those out to the group. And sometimes you'll have students who just come just to listen. And if there's students who are kind of lost in the class, I'll ask them to come to these office hours and just sit and listen. And they'll usually, start talking to other students during that office hour or the next one. But it's still important that we have one-on-one office hours as well for any private issues. But if students come there asking stuff that they could have asked in the group office hours, I'll try and convince them that they should come to the group office hours. Tamara, you've used the term take up quite a few times, and I'm not sure. So when I'm asked, so if a student asks a question and I put it out to the group, they work on it individually, and then they work on it in their groups. Then if maybe it's a multiple choice question that we did in class that they were having a problem with, or maybe it's a short answer question that we did in class, or just a concept, I'll ask people to come up and solve it at the board for each other, or I'll ask them to tell me one element. If it's a multiple choice question, I start with what is a wrong answer? What's one answer that you know that was wrong, and how did you and your group know that it was wrong? And that's how I actually take up my clicker questions. And the reason for that is so that they're focusing on reasoning, not the right answer. Because if we just get them to tell us what the right answer is, that's the only thing they're going to focus on. And there's a lot of learning within looking at the wrong answers as well. Does that make sense, Janet? Does that help you?
And Tamara, what's your attendance like? Joe was asking about that.
So in a class of about 250 at each office hour, I usually have 15 or so, 15, 20. And so I have 3 sets of office hours over the week, so they'll sometimes divvy up. For my 4th year courses, it's a lot smaller. It's usually people coming in as their team. But the large classes and the students, this is the one thing I get comments about every year on my evaluations that they like. I haven't had students, because I offer the one-on-one office hours as well, but they like that they, especially at a commuter school, that they get to meet other students. Yeah. And it's great for me because it actually puts us on the level together. We're all sitting at a table, we're just chatting. And when they introduce themselves, I always introduce myself. I'm like, hi, I'm Tamara. And I put it, you know, like, and they're all, yeah, of course we know that, but just, you know, for a cheap laugh. And then what I sometimes do is I'll take screenshots as well, or photographs of like what we did on the whiteboard or the blackboard, and I actually post that onto the office hours discussion board, just so that students don't miss it. But then I don't have to record the office hours, and students feel a lot more comfortable. But I'll give like a little quick spiel. And it's good for me because it's usually I'm making notes for myself about things that they're having difficulties with.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. And I would say that most of us are probably pretty familiar with the aftermath of an exam, a midterm or a final with our students. And one thing that we can do is change the way that we actually run these exams. And obviously we're talking about collaborative stuff. So collaborative testing is an option. So Tamara, we can probably ask the question. So we're curious, we know many of you may have already actually used these, and we're just wondering if you've used it before. So maybe a Y or an N in the chat if you get a chance. And I just want to note Jonathan's comments really interesting too about these sessions. So that's something that, well, before it disappears, I wanted to mention that. But
the supplemental learning is great. We also have that, and it's fantastic. And sometimes group office hours is a way to direct people to that as well, because they get comfortable talking with me and then they'll go, but I like that I can't go to those.
Yeah, and of course we are assuming that, you know, this would be in courses with exams. So not everybody's going to have that. Not every course is going to have that.
But we'll show you other ways to integrate this as well.
So looking like most people know, but we've got some partials and a few who have. So for those of you who are familiar with this, bear with us.
Yeah, I don't know what the sound is like, because my computer kept telling me the sound was being grabbed from an app that I didn't give any permission to, but just watch and we'll figure this out. So this is two-stage exam in my second year genetics class. I did ask for permission from the class before I filmed them. This is them taking the individual portion. And this is the group portion. This is a class of about 275.
So I can't hear the noise, but when you actually get a chance to look at our slides, you'll get to see the video. Oh, I love that part. And you'll hear just the change from the quiet of the individual to this roar in the group.
It has transformed my tests, and I've actually we're now giving up tests in a lot of our courses, but again, there's other ways to use these as well. With the two-stage exam, it's the approach that we've already described before for clickers and for group work. What happens is that it turns tests though into learning opportunities, and here students write an individual exam and then they submit that exam, and then they get into groups of 3 to 4 and they write the same or a slightly different exam together. This capitalizes on the fact that many students want to talk to each other right after the exam. And it harnesses that energy for good. And it also reduces the number of questions that you get right after a test. Is this right? Did I do this? And you know, some of those very anxious students, and we want to calm some of their fears. Now, in this setup, the individual exam, I have the individual exam set at 85% of the weighting. And that A, assesses the individual. B, it also helps diminish students' fear of their entire mark being based on group work. And it also provides time for thinking. The group part is worth 15%, so the remainder, and it provides immediate feedback when students are most receptive. So get to practice explaining to each other. They find out what they did right and what they did wrong, but they find out what they did wrong and how to correct that. And typically the group exam, we're looking at 2/3 of the time is spent on the individual exam and 1/3 of the time is spent on the group exam. And it follows directly afterwards, and the students are really well prepared, and that's why it doesn't take as much time. It's incentivized by the fact that the group mark can only bring your grade up. This makes it much less risky. It also makes me feel much more comfortable about implementing this. And there's only a few examples that aren't used for tests where I don't have that, where it can only bring the grade up. And in the references there, I've given you some papers where they found that groups typically, almost always, outperform the highest individual, the highest scoring individual's grade, which is great. And even the weakest groups still outperform the high performing students in the class. And they found that these are helpful for not just weak students, but also middle and strong performing students as well. Now, one of the keys to the 2-stage exam is that in the group part, you only get 1 exam per group. This drives students to actually come to a consensus. And because the group follows the individual exam, the students are really well prepared, and you can use this in a variety. You can get them to write answers out. You can fill in Scantrons, etc. So this form of a test, this 2-stage approach, provides immediate feedback to students during the group portion. And as I mentioned, what if the group all gets it wrong though? Well, again, research has shown that they can actually work it out, and most of those groups figure out the right answer. You can enhance that immediate feedback by using immediate feedback assessment technique cards, IFAC cards. And what they do here is that you match. Now, let me just take a step back for a moment. These are all then multiple choice for the group part, but I actually have on my individual exam, I have short answer ones. What I do is I convert those questions into multiple choice ones for the group exam. And there's a code, so each card that you order is a specific set of cards, and there are lots of different sets, so students can't memorize all of these. And you match your correct answer to where the star is on these. So students then scratch off, when they come to consensus, they scratch off the answer. And here for number 1, they've scratched off A, but there's no star. So then they have to keep going. So then they scratched off C. So they got together again, they discussed, and they scratched off C. They got the answer right. So if you get it right for on the very first try, you hit that star, you'll get the full number of points. If it takes you 2 tries, you get diminishing number of points. And then there's often a 3rd try. And then usually on our 4th and 5th try, there's 0, but we want students to keep going and find that out. This is the only test I've ever seen where I get high fives during a test, which is awesome. Students leave, they leave happier. As my friend Brett Gilly says, they leave happier than they ever thought they would leave a test. But TAs actually really enjoy these as well. And I think that was it that I wanted to say. I just said some stuff out of order. So, Tanya?
I've been trying to field some of the questions in the chat, so you might want to weigh in, but the big one I think might be a good one to discuss. A couple of people talked about accommodations and students who are writing in alternate centers. And I know you've set it up sometimes with the centers so students can get their extra time for the individual, but that doesn't necessarily mean they get the group time. And I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, so students tend to not need the individual. So what we've done is I went and talked to, and our university is large, and biology students are the largest, the proportion of users of our accommodation center. They make up, I think, 80% of the students who write at our accommodation center. And I'm talking classes of like where all the sections together have 1,700 students. We talk to the people at the accommodation center, and what we do is, for all the students who can, they start writing their exam earlier, their individual exam, so that they can then walk over and meet us at the group exam. Most of the students, even students with social anxiety, still want to write the group portion. And they see it as a learning opportunity. I've talked to a lot of the students. I think I've only ever had one student and they didn't want to write the first midterm. And then based on talking to students in the class later on, they wanted to write the second and the final exam. For students who can't make it to can't start their individual exam earlier so that they can get there in time for the group exam, we give them the average of the group mark for that 15%. And that is a separate accommodation that we make with them. It's not like we announce that to the whole class at first. Let me see if there's other. The students with disabilities, Haley, I've done this for years and we've interviewed students. And I've had blind students, students who require triple the amount of time and they've wanted to write these exams. It doesn't mean that all of the students want to, but generally after they've written the first one, they see the benefit of it. Any other questions? So they allow this.
So the other one, Joe was asking about people taking pictures of the exam, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure we don't allow phones for the in-person.
Do you mean like during the group part, Joe? They're so busy getting their exam done. Again, you're not leaving them like a lot of time. You're not stressing them out, but if they're going to, they're going to. But we focus on the fact that you've got. Why would you do so? That's actually part of our rules for the course for a test. Just like in the individual, you wouldn't have a phone out. So why would you want to harm your grade by the fact that you're gonna bring your grade up? I've never had an issue.
Okay.
Yep, there may be some. We've really tried to work hard with the accommodation center and with students who require all accommodations. And I've only ever had one student who did not. And we are open about being as flexible as possible with our students.
So a couple
I
people
usually have the exact same test, pretty close, except for short answer questions are converted into multiple choice questions. And I've given some examples of that in the slide deck that we'll post afterwards. I take out some of the really easier ones that I might have at the beginning, but I've actually gotten rid of a lot of those in my individual tests too. It is a shorter amount of time, so you really have to focus on what you want them to learn, which actually improved my classes, I have to say.
And in terms of the grouping, I mentioned sometimes you might want to do random, but in other cases, people do more calculated group selection, which would make sure that you've got appropriate gender ratios and things like that. Did you want to comment on that?
So in our classes so in our large 1001 class where we're in many, many rooms, we divide them up according to their lab groups. And they know that ahead of time, so they can then make arrangements. But we also tell them that if you don't have a group, what we do is, as we're handing out the exams, we say, everyone who doesn't have a group, come down to the front, and then we pair people up. And generally after that first exam, people know they find their own groups. There was something else that I wanted to say. What was your question, Tanya, about the?
Oh, just like the making a group versus random. I know I've seen both.
Oh,
so.
And so the biggest fiasco, I would say, although I was thrilled with it, the registrar was not, was a room we have for about 1,500 students. They were all writing, and we had organized the exam alternating rows, different sections, but each section had their own group exam, and they all got up and then went over to specific sections, and the registrar was really not happy. So we worked on how we would do this. So everyone sat in their own section, and we had an arrow on every table. So it told you whether you would stay facing forward or turn around during the group portion. And so in that case, that was the only time where we actually had groups that were preset, and they were preset based on where you were sitting. Yeah, 3 to 4 is ideal during these so that people can see the exam. And you will need a larger font for your exam, for your group exam. I usually do 13 to 14. so that people can see. If I do have some students who have lower visual acuity, I give them a separate exam that they can hold on to that is in 18 to 20 font.
So I have a question. I don't know if it's right or not. I have done this before, like creating exams and groups, but what I did before was like based on the grades that they obtained in the last exam, I create the groups because I don't want to have a group when I have a student that I know that put all the effort and everything, and then another one that is kind of lazy, and then affect the whole thing. I don't know if it's like bias or it's not. It's kind of unethical doing like based on the grades.
I don't think so. I mean, I've done that for my fourth year classes when I put together teams, but for the sake of my own sanity, for the large classes, I can't do that. Like I just can't, because I don't even know necessarily. Some people will be away that day. But what we have found is that students who have a big mix of students, if we sit there and watch them and other people have like mic'd groups and things like that while they're doing the exam, everybody's participating. Even if it's just the person who doesn't fully understand something saying, I don't understand here, and then somebody explaining it. And then so that's where you get the benefits for strong students, is they're actually explaining something, they're gaining a deeper understanding. And most students, 70% of groups rely on reaching consensus through discussion. Other groups, I think it's like 10% rely on voting, and if they have a consensus right away, they just go with that, make a quick discussion of it, and then move on. And then others are a majority. Only 2% of groups rely on one person, and that is even the more you incorporate this sort of group work into your class, I think that would be minimized. So I can see where you want a mix though of people. You want, like when I'm talking about my fourth year class, I do high, a low, and some middle performing students. What I don't want is all high achievers together. And I don't want all low achievers together too, because that performance does not indicate how much effort they've actually put into the course. We can't assume that low performing students are slackers necessarily, right? So
Perfect.
we
Thank
just
you.
need to watch those assumptions that we're making based on grades.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions? I've included as like a bunch of other slides about this in the slide deck, but if you have questions, this is my jam. So, feel free to ask me.
And I popped the CatMe link into the chat for people who want to see some of the ways that you can actually structure your teams. And Tamara and I will stick around for a little while in between this and the happy hour for if anybody wants to chat. But moving a little bit away from tests, like Joe mentioned in the chat that he uses this stuff for fun activities in class. And so do I. I actually love using the IFAC cards to do activities where maybe there's a challenge. I think you guys, some of you have witnessed the STI challenge in the past. We recreated that, but I've also used it for review sessions at the end of the term and kind of made that a team competition as well. So you can use IFAC cards and the two-stage approach for fairly fun things, for low stakes things. Tamara's also used two-stage in tutorials for genetics. So
and those don't use IFAC cards. They use like just a worksheet that they do.
Exactly. And Madison was asking about other ways to actually do this. And Tamara, did you want to show that slide, the options slide?
Yep. So we could use Google Forms online and use the branching logic. And I created a short one using some questions that Tanya gave me because, hint, I'm not a microbiologist. So, and those questions are just fairly basic questions. But they'll show you that if you get it wrong, you're sent to a second version, same question, but just a second attempt. And again, and you can just using branching logic, tell them if they get it right, the form just moves them on to the next question. And the other thing is that I actually use this for training my TAs as well at the beginning of the year. So you know how sometimes TAs remember like the big ideas of stuff or the things that they're working on, but they don't remember the smaller things that they're going to need to help students with. I actually give them the final exam for the course on during our first meeting, and they write it as an individual and then a subset of it, and then they write it as a group, and they figure out all of the hard things. And every week we go through the tutorials that way as well. And they can also point out them what's wrong with the questions. But I found that's very helpful because it makes them far more aware of what they don't know, but also what everybody's strengths are. So we know who we can go to within the group because everybody's working in different labs, right? I've also done these on CrowdMark as well, but CrowdMark, as Tanya and I were talking, I'm lucky right now that we have CrowdMark, but that could be ripped away from me at any moment, depending on whether or not the school decides to continue paying. Two-stage exams and quizzes, all of these things work best in classes where you're already using active collaborative learning strategies because it reinforces that you think that this is important. But some people think that it's actually a good entry point. So maybe you aren't using as much collaboration as you want to. You don't have to change anything that's happening in your class right now, but you're just changing how your tests are done. And this was, I think, a group at the University of Hawaii that had found that this was very good for then triggering people to change their courses. But they did have to go through with students what it would mean to actually write a two-stage. Whereas if you're using active learning strategy, the collaborative stuff in your classes, then they're already practicing for this all the time.
And just to give you guys more options here for asynchronous discussion of papers or textbook chapters, things like that, there are some tools available that allow online social annotation. And my familiarity is with Perusall. It's free. You can require that they buy a textbook through it, which I would not do, but any kind of open access book or whatever you can actually bring into your Perusall class, give students some instructions, and then they can go through, they can read, they can highlight, and actually ask questions, make points, tie things back to stuff we talked about in class. Hypothesis is a similar tool. I have not used it to integrate to the LMS. It costs money. I don't have that, but you can just throw that up, Tamara. I found it was really helpful not only getting students to actually read papers and read the materials I wanted them to read for class, but they often made some really interesting comments and also showed me where they maybe were having some difficulties and weren't getting things. And I included this little thing on the right because this was a student in microbial ecology who basically told us, she annotated that she was annotating to see how her thought process developed, which is awesome. I was really happy to see that because we spent quite a bit of time in microbial ecology talking about how reading a paper is not like just reading a comic book or something that's easy to sit down and read. You have to come back, you have to think about things, you might have to look stuff up. And this way they not only got to have somebody tell them that's okay, they saw other people doing that too. And I think that was something that was very beneficial. So I won't talk a lot more about that, but if anybody wants to see Perusall or whatever, just let me know.
Did anybody have any questions about Perusall? I really want to use it this year, and I will be bothering Tanya for all of her knowledge for it. In my fourth year course, I have students write a critique on a primary article of their choosing. And during the class time, we walk through examples of critiquing. We critique papers together. Students also know that they will have an opportunity to resubmit later on in the course if they want to, once they've gotten back their paper with some with their grade. And I post rubrics, the rubric for the critique online. We walk through it, and I post some exemplars that they can look at on the LMS. Regardless, students have little experience with, written assignments where it's not maybe a lab assignment and where they need to really back it up with evidence in a different way than maybe when they're writing their lab reports, and they're anxious about reading the papers. Tanya just touched on this. Most students in their goals for my class will say that they want to learn how to read primary articles faster. And I'm like, can't do that, but we can learn how to read them better. And the other issue was that I was really, really tired of getting papers in for that first submission that were barely even drafts. Like they were drafty drafts. And they were really hard to read, and they were ultimately very, very hard to grade. And so one of the solutions that I came up with was to extend an already existing peer review. So students would hand in this paper, they get back peer review, they could resubmit it at the end. But I kind of made it a little bit more structured. So students were asked to bring in 2 copies of their critique, ostensibly to submit to me, for me to grade, and then to their peer reviewer. And instead, when they got to class, they were first given the low exemplar that had been posted online, and they graded that according to the rubric. During this period, you hear a lot of like frustration. There's a lot of sighing. There is a lot of sighing. And then they are given the high performing exemplar. And these were written by students. I approached them, asked them if I could use them. All identifiers have been stripped. And they mark that. And that's a little bit happier time. And then they pull out the copy that they were supposed to hand in to me, and they mark that according to the rubric. And there's some sighing again. And as they realized that maybe what they did wasn't quite great, as one student said, I found out that my boyfriend really is a sucky editor when she marked this. Then what happens is that at the end of that class, because this takes up a whole class, they get into their peer editing pairs and they exchange papers. And the very next class, what happens is that they spend 15 to 30 minutes, typically close to 30 minutes, discussing each paper. And so students, the peer reviewer has made comments on the paper. They've also filled out a peer reviewer form where they're asked to identify whether the person is unsatisfactory, like below the level that we would want, developing a skill, or they've achieved that skill in writing their critique. And they also are asked, what is the biggest thing that if they change this would make the biggest impact on, what is the thing that if they changed it would make the biggest impact on the paper? And I use that for all peer reviewing because I found that it generates very good comments. The papers that I receive after this are so much better. The result is that I get drastically better papers. Some students then form for the rest of the term editing pairs within my class, and lots of them have used editing pairs in the other classes that they're in as well, which is fantastic.
Okay, very briefly, because I know we're running out of time, just want to say you can allow some collaborative input on things like how you're going to grade, and that seems to bring in a little bit more buy-in and so on for students if you let them help you with deciding how they're going to be graded on a project. And that way they're probably a little less upset if you've put something in as being worth more. So I did a couple of things with my class this year, word cloud of what they would want to see, what would make a good video. And then we actually allowed them to sort of rank the different components that were going to be marked. And that seemed to work pretty well.
And I've done the same thing with my class, just not online. We did it face-to-face. They did it in groups and then put their information up on the board, and we generated a full rubric from that. And even though this takes time, it is so worth it because students are so much more thoughtful when they're completing their assignments.
I'm not sure we really have time for this. What do you think, Tamara? Do you want to just maybe ask in the chat and
Yeah. What do you think? How would we prepare students to work together in class? If you could just pop that answer into the chat. We were going to do Jamboard.
Yep.
Which every time I hear Jamboard, I want to say it 3 times, as I've told many people. but
And if you want to check out Jamboard as a tool, I'm putting the link into what we've made. But at this point, for the sake of time, you know, what would you suggest as a way to help prepare students to have a good group experience? Okay. So we've got compressed versions. Oh, test runs. Okay. Yeah. So that sounds like a good idea.
yeah, even when we're doing participation-based in-class work, generally the first week we don't even, just in case you miss some classes or whatever, there's just no grades attached at that point.
Oh,
Yes.
those really good points here. Yeah.
Yes, community contract. We do this.
Yeah.
Keep materials well ahead of time.
Yeah, and being clear, I think that's something that's important. And yeah, icebreakers are good. Get people to actually know each other a little bit.
For the first couple of weeks, I always remind students for the group portion of the clicker questions or worksheets that they should be introducing each other, like themselves to each other, and they should be referring to each other by name rather than just pointing at people. Yes, explaining. That is the biggest thing. And then creating that community contract. And what does it mean for teams to work? Teams to work doesn't mean you all agree instantly. Just as because you disagree doesn't mean that you aren't going to come up with a better answer. Roles and responsibilities for group sheets and for worksheets. I keep calling them group sheets. For worksheets, this is good. Like, who's going to write down the answer? Who's going to keep us on task, on time? All of that is important. And explaining that all of these are there to support their learning, that they're all linked to your outcomes of your course. And you can do some fun ones at the beginning. I mean, I think Tanya and I, for the longest time when we taught together, we had a question about toothpaste use for our first clicker question, just to like set the bar as like a really low one of this is just, to get you active. And then, is there something that you heard today that you are going to commit to trying in the future? Think about that. You can head to Mentimeter, or you can just throw it in the chat, because we wanted to have time to have a discussion, but we kind of had that discussion throughout. So and again, if you have any questions about this, any concerns about any of these, to come to us, because if no point in reinventing the wheel, right? If somebody else has already solved that problem,
I'll also say, don't try and do all of them. Like, sometimes it's really easy to think that, oh, I can improve everything by doing like 5 things. I'd say choose one for now, unless you've got like an army of TAs and support staff and so on.
The collaborative rubric has been really helpful because people get into groups initially, and then the bigger group, the bigger class, and that's been really, really helpful. And then just some final, we always talk about the value of a collaboration, and this is a quote, the top one from Dan Schwartz, that I always use when I'm giving a talk on 2-stage exams. If you ask for help on an exam, it's cheating. But if you don't ask for help in the real world, then you are a fool. Because work is collaborative, and it doesn't mean that every single moment has to be collaborative, but we want to help students learn help-seeking behavior and appropriate help-seeking behavior. And I love this quote from a student that they're linking it to what happens in the real world. And I have like pages and pages of quotes that from students about like the collaborative work in class, but also the 2-stage exams, because they have to do a reflection after each of their tests. And I don't get to look at those till the end of the year. That they just get auto points associated with them. And I'm always astounded that even the students who don't like the 2-stage exams for the first time end up by the end of the year liking them. Although I do have one student who stands out in my head as somebody who did not like them at all and had no problem telling me that every class.
There's always one, no matter what.
Yeah. And we've talked about collaboration, and this was a collaboration. My dog's about to start barking. We're getting a delivery, so.
I thought Maggie just wanted credit, so I just put the link to our slides in the chat. Please feel free to download them, ask us any questions, reach out. We love talking about teaching. Tamara is totally the expert on two-stage stuff, so she is the person you want to talk to for all that goodness. And awesome to see you guys.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for a really great summary and presentation of some really exciting techniques. I know whenever I leave one of these sessions, I, like you were saying, Tanya, just kind of want to change everything and have all these ideas that I want to try and get my students excited about. So I'm certainly going to be changing what I do again next year. I see we do have some questions, and you guys mentioned you'd be willing to stay on sort of in between the break. For the sake of keeping on time, I'm going to just ask that we postpone that for a minute. We have Dr. Ayush Kumar with us, who is, of course, the president of our society, and he's going to be saying, has a few words to say to us just about the CSM conference generally. So Ayush, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. Well, it's great to be here. And so my name is Ayush Kumar, and I'm speaking to you from University of Manitoba. So, first thing I would like to do is thank the Canadian Society for Microbiologists Committee on Microbiology Undergraduate Education, CMUE, for organizing this workshop. I really would like to commend the work done by CMUE, particularly during the pandemic, where they organize workshops throughout the year. So thank you, Dr. Joe Rubin, Dr. Maria Davis, Dr. Tanya Noel, Dr. Heather Dietz, and Dr. Nicole Sukhdev. And thank you also to the workshop organizers today, Dr. Tamara Kelly and Dr. Noel as well. I would like to say one thing that in today's world, it is critical for us to understand and appreciate the diversity among student population to strengthen our instructional modes. And I'll use a microbiology anecdote here. So as microbiologists, we know that to ensure that all bacterial species from a given environment are able to survive and thrive, we have to use multiple growth medium. There's no one single growth medium that will support all bacteria. So we simply cannot be using single mode of instruction to a diverse student population. Forums like this are critical to inform changes and to improve our teaching style to accommodate different learning styles. So I would like to thank you all for attending, and please do let us know if you have any other ideas for workshops. And I would like to invite you all to the CSM meeting that starts next week. And thank you very much.